I just want to give a brief welcome. We have 4 panelists today. I'm going to be a panelist and amateur moderator at the same time, but I just wanted to welcome everybody to our second annual ISIS event. Right, Austin?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, our second annual ISIS event, and let me tell you, if we end up with a third annual ISIS event, I think we're in a lot of trouble. So let's hope this is the last one of these.
Yeah, let's take a vote on that at the end of the panel if we think we're going to have one.
I don't think we're.
See you next year.
Unless the third one is a retrospective, then it's okay. But we have 4 diverse panelists that have some interesting things to say about ISIS, which is in the news, of course. I'm Stuart Gottlieb. My colleagues on the panel, Austin Long, Dipali Mukhopadhyay, and Jason Healy, all teach here at SIPA in various aspects of international security policy and international relations. The pamphlet has bios for everybody, so I'm not going to go into long introductions. I'm just going to describe what we're going to do. Each one of us is going to give about a 10-minute talk from our angle and perspectives on what's going on with ISIS nowadays. And we're going to come at it from some interesting and different perspectives. There are 4 panelists for a reason, because there are different viewpoints on this stuff that is very important for us to be discussing and having conversations about, because clearly we need to do some thinking about policy right now. So what we're going to do is have about 10 minutes each, and then we might have a little time for some panel discussion if any of the panelists have a question for any of the other presenters, just for a few minutes. But what we really want to do is get to the audience and see what some of you think and have some interaction, some discussion, and some conversation, because I believe a lot of people are very interested in this topic. People have different opinions on it. And we want to keep this as much of an open forum as possible. So I'm going to begin, and then we'll take it from there. So now I'm in the panelist role. So like I mentioned, a little more than a year ago, Austin and I did an event in this very room to discuss what was at the time President Obama's new strategy against the so-called Islamic State, which the president announced on September 10th, 2014, following a string of blitzkrieg military successes by the group that enabled it to capture towns and cities all across northern Syria and Iraq. And after the well-publicized beheadings of American journalists and aid workers. And in the president's primetime address, he said that he and his national security team were initiating a strategy to, quote, degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. But today, despite a few setbacks, ISIS is in many ways stronger than ever. It has gained control of more strategic cities such as Palmyra in central Syria and Ramadi in western Iraq. It still controls or operates freely in territory roughly the size of England, governs roughly 8 million people in Syria and Iraq, and has expanded its ability to sell crude oil on the black market for a steady stream of financing to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a month. And it has opened up official ISIS branches in Libya, Egypt, Afghanistan, and Yemen, and has forged formal affiliations with militant Islamist groups in Mali, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Tunisia, Indonesia, Algeria, among other places. So the degrade and destroy strategy, as currently employed, is not working. What I'd like to do today is offer an explanation for why the strategy has not worked and what we can glean from the past year in order to craft more effective strategies moving forward, recognizing there is a certain urgency to the current threat context. For example, Brussels, the capital of the European Union and headquarters of NATO, is, as we speak, on its 4th day of a full lockdown. Now, in my view, the stated White House strategy of degrade and destroy has not worked for 2 big macro reasons. And I want to learn a little bit from these 2 big macro reasons. The first big macro reason that the strategy hasn't worked is that the administration, pretty soon after they publicly announced their initial anti-ISIS strategy, moved away from a strategy premised on degrade and destroy and toward a strategy premised much more on containment. Now, there was nothing inherently illogical or even surprising about that. In the minds of the administration, there was a sense that if the core of ISIS could be contained in a defined territory, then it could be efficiently unraveled and ultimately destroyed using U.S. air power from above and friendly troops like the Kurdish Peshmerga on the ground below. But this leads us to the second big macro reason why the administration's stated degrade and destroy strategy is not working. And by the way, this explains why the administration was comfortable using containment as its primary strategic guidance in the first place. And that is that the administration, like most Western governments, simply does not fully grasp the nature of the threat emanating from ISIS and like-minded militant Islamist groups, what actually makes them tick, their historic narratives, their long-term goals, and most of all, their adaptability. You know, their ad hoc nature, their ability to zig when we zag. One of the ironies of the past few weeks is that most reporting in the West has been that the recent string of high-profile ISIS attacks, the downing of the Russian plane over Egypt on November 4th, the horrific twin suicide bombings in the Beirut suburbs on November 12th, which did not get nearly enough coverage as far as I'm concerned, and then, of course, the Paris attacks the next day on November 13th, the reporting has been that this recent string of attacks, particularly the one in Paris, the heart of a Western European capital, represents a, quote, new strategy for ISIS, unquote. Consider two headlines on the same day, both on November 15th, one from the Wall Street Journal, quote, Paris attack suggests shift in Islamic State strategy, unquote, and one for the New York Times that same day, quote, strategy shift for ISIS inflicting terror on distant lands, unquote. And yesterday, the New York Times had another headline on the front page, quote, latest attacks seen as evidence of a shift by ISIS, unquote. And of course, many other newspapers and analysts are saying similar things. So these latest attacks have clearly awoken the world to a broadening ISIS strategy, but what may surprise you is that in 2015 alone, ISIS carried out dozens of international attacks that killed nearly 1,000 people, even before the Russian plane was taken down earlier this month. Attacks that started last January in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo attack, which was inspired by ISIS and committed on behalf of ISIS by some folks trained in another part of the world. But then direct ISIS attacks, bombings and shootings in Libya, multiple attacks in Tunisia, multiple attacks in Cairo, major attacks in Yemen, big attacks in Turkey, all taking place before the Russian plane came down. And yes, it does seem that ISIS has shifted gears more toward international attacks, and in particular attacks in the West. But there's nothing new about that. For those who were paying attention, ISIS has had this as part of its grand designs from the get-go, and they were not at all shy about it. There's even an ISIS official in charge of overseeing attacks outside Iraq and Syria, a guy named Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, a 40-year-old Syrian who's also the official spokesman for the Islamic State, and one of the closest associates of the group's supreme leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-anointed caliph. Again, none of this is new. Just days after Obama announced his anti-ISIS strategy on September 10th, 2014, Adnani released a 42-minute audio clip across a whole host of social media in which he called on individual Muslims living in Western countries to kill civilians, quote, by any means necessary, unquote, and to do so without waiting for instructions from the group's leaders. Quote, if you can, kill a disbelieving American or European, especially the spiteful and filthy French, or an Australian or a Canadian, then rely upon Allah and kill him in any manner or way, however that may be, unquote. Now, some may not have known about this. Some maybe didn't believe it. Some may have downplayed it. The problem is, over the past year, while the United States was mostly operating under a containment strategy, inside those supposedly contained areas, ISIS was gaining in strength in numbers. In fact, since Adnani released his audio clip in September 2014, thousands of Western recruits have traveled to Syria and Iraq to fight with ISIS and also to be trained and sent back home. So unlike September 2014, it's no longer simply about inspiring Muslims in the West over the internet to carry out small-scale attacks. It's now increasingly about much more sophisticated and capable ISIS foot soldiers, formerly trained by ISIS commanders in their safe havens in Syria and Iraq, being sent back home to carry out much more sophisticated and deadly attacks, like the ones we have seen recently in Tunisia, Turkey, Egypt, Beirut, and Paris, and we must assume they are planning more and most likely bigger attacks. And again, for those paying attention, none of this should be new or surprising. ISIS is not actually inventing this strategy. It is simply following a strategy that has been promoted for centuries by the spiritual standard bearers of this militant, radicalized version of Sunni Islam, starting with Ibn Taymiyyah in the Middle Ages, through Muhammad Abdel Wahhab in the 18th century, through key intellectuals like Rashid Rida, Muhammad al-Faraj, and Sayyid Qutb in the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, it was Farage who made famous the long-standing goal of globalized jihadis to destroy two sets of enemies they view as standing in their way, the so-called near enemies, which would be the apostate Muslim rulers, and so-called far enemies, the infidels that support them, mostly from the West. And all that ISIS is doing is calibrating the strategy according to capabilities and opportunities. And this, by the way, is why President Obama came under such withering criticism for saying just hours after the Beirut bombings and just hours before the Paris attacks that, quote, significant progress, unquote, has been made against ISIS, that ISIS in Iraq and Syria was, quote, not gaining strength, unquote, and that, quote, we have contained them, unquote. And this criticism was not just from the usual suspects on the Republican side of the aisle, but from, for example, Dianne Feinstein, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, who said in response to Mr. Obama's statements, quote, I have never been more concerned. I read the intelligence faithfully. ISIS is not contained. ISIS is expanding, unquote. An even stronger critique came from one of the brightest minds in Washington on matters of intelligence and counterterrorism, Michael Vickers, who has worked as a senior advisor to both Democrat and Republican administrations, most recently serving as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence in the Obama Pentagon. He said, quote, by any measure, our strategy in Iraq and Syria is not succeeding or is not succeeding fast enough. The administration is playing a quote-unquote long game when a more rapid and disruptive strategy is required. Right now, time is not on our side, unquote. And that last point, time is not on our side, is the most ominous and the most important. And it's on this point that I'd like to conclude, because I think I'm sort of running out of time.
You're good.
And we can bring this back up in some discussion, because I think what's important is a recognition that terrorism and counterterrorism is a dynamic, and the two sides play off each other. And connecting the long game containment strategy with the ISIS strategy is a very important thing to do right now, because both strategies will influence each other, you know. And a big concern right now is that ISIS is currently taking advantage of a softer long game approach, which I want to point out is centered on Western values and American values. It's centered on avoiding both American casualties and avoiding Muslim civilian casualties in areas controlled by ISIS and where ISIS operates. So on the one hand, the American strategy over the last year makes perfectly understandable sense from both the politics of it, meaning trying to limit American casualties, and also the strategic side of it. It's very important to limit civilian casualties in the Muslim world, because any casualties on that side are going to be used as powerful recruiting tools by ISIS. By the way, this is why everyone asks how come all these targets popped up for the French to bomb after Paris. So all of a sudden there are these targets in Raqqa, and the United States is now hitting oil convoys that they hadn't hit before. And the answer is the United States was reluctant to hit those targets before Paris because they didn't want to have civilian casualties. So this is all very understandable, but we have to think a little bit ahead. The 9/11 Commission report more than 10 years ago now warned that we have to avoid failures of imagination. And what's happening right now is, against the best wishes of Western ideals and principles in fighting a war like this, where the long war makes some sense, ISIS is taking perfect advantage of it. And the problem is they might use these safe havens and an increased capability to commit a series of Paris attacks, a sort of a Mumbai model on a mass scale, or they might get their hands on some dirty bombs, or at the maximum end of the extreme scenarios, a crude nuclear device. And that's their goal. Their goal would be to get the West to see themselves in a war. Hollande is already calling it a war. Pope Francis is calling it the beginning of World War III. So the goal of ISIS is to spark this type of a war, and the best way they can do that is by committing these major attacks. So what I would urge, and we can have some more time for discussion on this, are counterterrorism strategies that recognize not just what's going on today, but what the future might look like in the aftermath of one of those attacks, because all of a sudden casualties get taken off the table and other values come into play. And I think that's a very dangerous world. We might defeat ISIS, but in the same time, we might end up defeating our own values. And ISIS knows that better than anybody, and that's a big part of what their strategy is right now. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Austin, and I'm going to hold on to this for you.
Excellent. You can look at my phone too, since you have the 1980s phone. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about not necessarily strategies per se, because I think that's broader. There's a lot more to it, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the military situation and military options to deal with the Islamic State. And of course, The thing I've been worried about for over a month now happened today, which is you had one of the U.S. NATO allies shoot down a Russian fighter jet. I have been sweating this. I was in Moscow when the bombing started, and I immediately began worrying that this was going to happen, and lo and behold, it has. So this is a new wrinkle, which I'll touch on at the end. So from the military perspective, the situation is slightly better than it was when we did this event a little over a year ago. There's been a stabilization of different fronts. The Islamic State, as the president said, has been more or less contained in a geographic expansion sense, though I think Stuart is right, that's not quite the same as being fully contained. The Iraqi government, and particularly the U.S. Kurdish allies, has made some progress. So you've seen places like Sinjar taken back by the Kurds. You've seen some progress in taking back parts of the city of Ramadi. But overall, it's not been a decisive change by any stretch. And so this has led, in the wake of the Paris attacks, for calls for the U.S. to do a lot more, and not just air power, but you have some, particularly Republican candidates, calling for significant numbers of U.S. boots on the ground. And so there's a lot to like about that in terms of achieving short-term effects. There's almost no doubt that, assuming you could get over the logistics hurdles of staging U.S. ground forces, presumably they would start in Iraq and then move into Syria, but as I'll touch on, that gets quite complicated. But in Iraq, at least, U.S. forces could undoubtedly, though with some difficulty, take back places like Ramadi. The United States demonstrated more than a decade ago that it could take places like Fallujah back from the forerunner, essentially, of the Islamic State. So I don't think there's any doubt that this would be effective. But the question remains, and it is the question that has bedeviled U.S. strategy in Iraq for more than a decade, is once you've taken it back, who holds it? If it's the United States, then we need to prepare to be sending young Americans to Iraq and probably Syria for an indefinite period of time. An indefinite doesn't mean an administration or two. An indefinite period starts to look a little bit like the U.S. Position in Korea or for a long time in West Germany. Decades of occupation. I think even despite the attacks in Paris and elsewhere, that the appetite is not there for that. And I don't think the appetite is there in most of Europe. And I think the appetite is even fairly limited. Again, I'll come back to this at the end. I think the appetite is fairly limited even in Russia for an open-ended commitment. I think their attitude towards casualties is a little different. I think their attitude towards staying power is a little different, but I don't think they have an unlimited appetite for this. Okay, so if outside intervention is probably, and we can talk about this more in Q&A, I think probably off the table in an indefinite sense, then who follows behind U.S. and other Western troops if they take this territory back? And the answer is we still don't have an answer. I was at an event that was off the record, so I won't say who, but people involved in the current effort to train the Iraqi military, and the former head of the command that built the Iraqi military from 2003 to 2011 was sitting right next to me when I asked the question. I said, okay, what's different now, right? You're telling me we're going to build the Iraqi ground forces and we're going to train them, and we're going to provide them equipment, et cetera, et cetera. I heard this story from roughly 2004 to 2011. Didn't really pay off. So what's different now? The answer I got, and I'm gonna quote directly because I almost fell over. Because the other answer is you're just better than this general sitting to my right. So if you want to say that to his face, go for it. But that was not the approach. The answer was we need a surge of Iraqi political will. So that was interesting to me for two reasons. One, the term surge has like been burned into the consciousness of people. Like if something is good, it's a surge, okay? But more importantly, why do you think this is forthcoming? And I got kind of a shrug. And so, there's a military saying, hope is not a plan, shrugs are not a plan either, right? So this is the fundamental problem that the U.S. has in Iraq. The Kurds, who are a very capable set of allies, are not capable of occupying all of the territory that the Islamic State holds. The Popular Mobilization Forces, which had been built up into functionally a parallel army, even though they're more a collection of militias, but they're functionally a parallel army. they really don't have the ability, even with extensive Iranian support, to take back all of the areas that need to be taken back in Iraq alone. So we're left with the question of, even if the U.S. goes in and we clear out Ramadi, we clear out Fallujah, it's going to be deja vu all over again, right? We cleared out Fallujah in 2004, we cleared out Ramadi in 2006, and then, once we left, things start to fall apart. So that's why even though I think the instinct is understandable to send in U.S. ground troops, even in Iraq, where I think we have a somewhat better situation, it's very problematic. And if you cross the border into Syria, things get much worse because there are more players, and particularly the Russians. The Russians, at least for the time being, appear strongly committed to ensuring that, if not Assad himself, at least the Alawite power structure that he represents, if it doesn't dominate the country, they at least want it to have a seat at the table and to survive. They have committed significant combat power to do this, not just air power, but also some limited number of ground troops, which they could expand. They've committed artillery. So this is a pretty serious intervention by the Russians, and people are right to say this is probably their most serious external intervention outside of their near abroad in decades. So if the U.S. intervenes without the Assad regime's permission, we are functionally at war with the Assad regime, and therefore, by extension, we may have a conflict with the Russians, who still are a significant military power in a conventional sense, and certainly the only country with nuclear capabilities that rival the United States. And that's why I in particular worry about military options involving Syria, and things like the events today with the downing of the Russian fighter is aggressive action in Syria that is not coordinated appropriately with the Russians and the Assad regime carries an escalation risk that I think we have not seriously thought about in more than 25 years. And that's a risk of a conflict that could spiral out of control, involve NATO allies, and ultimately the risk of nuclear escalation. That sounds like I'm being melodramatic, but I actually, given the state of U.S.-Russian relations and or NATO-Russian relations over the past 2 years, and I spent last year working in the Pentagon primarily on Russian strategic issues, I don't think I'm exaggerating. I'm not saying it's a huge risk, but it's a risk that has more or less been zero from the 1990s until quite recently. So that's why I think, however constrained U.S. military options are in Syria, they're even more constrained in Iraq. I think they're even more constrained in Syria. So that's the bad news. Is there any potential good news? I think more can be done, but it is not going to be decisive. I think at best you can, if Stuart's characterization is right, that right now we've been containing, I think you can shift to a more aggressive degrade, but I don't think the option of decisive long-term strategic defeat is in the cards as long as there is no indigenous force capable of holding the territory. And in Syria, the United States has put its faith in a certain set of moderate actors. They are clearly not the strongest ground force in Syria. They're probably about fourth after the Islamic State, the Army of Conquest, and the Russian-backed Assad regime. So they can't be an occupy force or a hold force, even if the United States does intervene. So that's the bad news. The good news is that the more aggressive degrade is possible. As Stuart said, with loosening of rules of engagement, it's possible to strike more targets, both mobile targets. The U.S. has been reluctant to strike a lot of these moving targets because, of course, if you see an oil tanker leaving an Islamic State-controlled area, it's probably associated with the Islamic State, but your ability to do real-time assessment and ensure that that's, in fact, a bad guy and not a neutral is pretty limited. So the risk of civilian casualties go up. At the same time, when you're striking targets in urban areas, even with precision-guided munitions, the risk of casualties is always there, even when you're patient. In other circumstances, the U.S. has been willing to run that risk. So in Afghanistan in 2001, we were willing to run that risk, in part because of the context of the times. In Fallujah in 2004, we ran that risk, but we also made a very explicit effort to surround the city and encourage the civilian population to leave, so that anybody that was left, we could more freely be assured that they were not bad guys. Even then, there were still civilian casualties, and of course, Fallujah itself was largely leveled in the center. And then the U.S. worked to rebuild it, but who then is going to do the rebuilding in Syria and Iraq this time if the U.S. is not there in large numbers? I think more special operations missions inside these countries, and I think given what we know, there's probably more than what we've heard about in the press, but I think you can be more aggressive with that, but that increases the risk that the U.S. will take casualties. We've already had one special operator killed in a raid on a prison in Hawija just a couple of weeks ago. I still remember the event in 2011 when a helicopter carrying a large number of Navy SEALs was shot down, and that was in Afghanistan where the U.S. controlled the airspace. You can imagine launching that kind of raid into Syria now that the Russians have intervened and maybe looking for an opportunity to get some payback for today's events. It might be significant. So there are things that can be done, but at best they will degrade, not decisively defeat the Islamic State. And so I think that's what we have to frame all of our thoughts about, at least the military side of the response, to be, is that there is no silver bullet, certainly in a military sense, and that this is a problem that, despite our joking that we hope that this will be the last one, I think this is going to be a problem that is with us for some time, unfortunately. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Austin. Now we'll turn it over to Dipali.
Thanks, Stuart. I guess I'm going to echo the expressions of many, including, I think, the kind of theme running through Austin's remarks, that the horrors of what we witnessed in Paris don't really diminish or offer solutions to the kind of paralytic challenges that surround any sort of more aggressive intervention in Iraq or in Syria. And I'm going to focus on the Syrian side and kind of interrogate a few of the proposed prescriptions that have been put on the table. My interest in Syria came from looking at the parallels between the current experience in Syria and the experience in Soviet-occupied Afghanistan and the struggle on the part of the Afghan Mujahideen and that resistance to topple the communist government and expel the Soviets, and the ways in which, more generally, Western governments think about how to effectively support an opposition. And this question of, can one cultivate a good rebellion, which is kind of the mirror image of the challenge that Austin just described of, can one cultivate a good government in Iraq? And I think a lot of the challenges are really mirrored. So when we think about support for the Syrian opposition, we've heard a lot about the woes of the moderate opposition. How do we figure out who they are? How do we cultivate them? The $500 million program that led to 4 or 5, et cetera. So I've been kind of looking to see, well, is there any sort of silver lining to this story? Any part of, and I've spent a bunch of time on the Turkish-Syrian border, and so I found a recent piece by the International Crisis Group, which is, I think, a sober, thoughtful organization on these questions. They wrote a paper in September of this year where they argue that the focus on the northern part of the country has been the wrong focus, and that we need to shift down and look at the southern band of resistance. And that there we have Islamist forces that are mingled with jihadist forces, but that they're substantial and they're anchored in those communities, and for a variety of reasons they explain that this is a set of forces that we need to engage more actively. But when I kind of looked into the footnotes of that report, and again, I think this is a sober assessment, a couple of things jumped out at me. One is that they're clear that Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate inside Syria, is the dominant force in the southern part of the country. Not ISIS, but Jabhat al-Nusra. They're also clear that while these commanders are capable and many of them anchored in their own communities, they have no link or connection to any kind of national political opposition institution or leadership. We know that that opposition leadership, at least in theory, exists inside and is operating out of Turkey, but these commanders, much like many of the armed actors inside Syria, don't really engage or acknowledge those actors. And finally, it's clear as you read the report that these actors, while they might be capable fighters and might even be paying lip service and maybe more to the idea of a civilian kind of presence on the ground and cultivation of governance, themselves have a very limited capacity to govern the territories that they might be able to seize. So what happens when we look at that picture, and that's the place where the ICG, International Crisis Group, is telling us, focus there, it's a better story than the chaotic situation in the other parts of the country, is now we've moved into a space of trying to think about cultivating governance. So we're not just talking now about how can we encourage the capture of territory, but once that territory is captured, and this comes back again to Austin's point in Iraq, what is going to happen after that? So I have been kind of investigating this question of how do Western countries support good rebel governance, right, if that can be done. And here what becomes really challenging is that we don't, much as we've seen in post-conflict countries where we're trying to support good governance on the part of fledgling post-conflict governments and all of the challenges that that presents, we're not terribly effective, Western donors, that is, at figuring out how to translate the idea of good governance into actually the cultivation of capable institutions that deliver governance the way we wish to see it. We tend to think about things like, can we use the delivery of humanitarian assistance and have local actors, local councils, in this case in Syria, mimic service delivery that the government would do, and in that way build a kind of legitimacy, political legitimacy, and create a following and create a kind of authority out of that. But that doesn't really address a lot of the other facts on the ground, which are that the actors that are the most capable on the ground, both in terms of fighting, but also in terms of constructing order, look very different from what we in the West think about as moderate good governing. And it's very unclear empirically when we look back at past cases, where is the evidence that outsiders have the ability to pick and choose who will be the good governors and marginalize the bad governors, and to kind of construct forms of political order that reflect our own ambitions in terms of what we want this space to look like. So this becomes challenging. Let's say we set that challenge aside and we say we can create conditions in which rebels can not only take territory, but they can actually, while they're taking territory, begin to govern in better ways. And that cities might then begin to fall. Either regime-controlled cities or ISIS-controlled cities would fall to them. The question still remains, what comes the day after that day after, right? So let's go back to the Afghan case. The Mujahideen, let's say, we understand that history is that the struggle of the Mujahideen, supported by the West, drove out the Soviets. The story that we saw that happened after that is not a comforting story, right? We see a country that then spirals into a civil war, and the war makers, who were quite successful, are unable to translate that military victory into a state-making process that we can recognize. You have commanders that see spoils that they want to then fight for and improve those claims. You see a detached political elite, and you see ongoing meddling from the neighbors that really ultimately create a space that's anarchic and into which we see a brutal but more ideologically and politically coherent Islamist force rising into power, and we all know where the story goes from there. But we don't really have to go that far back. We can look at the current case of Libya and the way that events are unfolding there to understand that the toppling part isn't really the hard part. It's what comes after that. So I guess the final question then that we would ask is, well, what is the harm of trying, right? At least we should be trying to do something. We recognize that the current strategy isn't working, so why don't we try and do something? Something is better than nothing. Here, the support for rebels is one option. The other option that's being bandied about is the idea of safe zones and the no-fly zone concept. And here I just want to circle back to another historical experience that I think is important to think about, and that's the case of the Balkans. And a number of authors have been writing about this recently, that this idea of safe zones isn't a new one. We saw the experience of safe areas in Bosnia, and in that case it was a promise of protection without a mandate and a military heft behind it to actually provide protection. And Dominic Tierney is one person who's recently written about this and explains that if we're really going to create a space which is safe for refugees to return, or in which this opposition would somehow regroup, we're talking about a kind of presence that would be necessary to actually defend that space. And who is going to be providing that? And who is going to be welcome by Syrians in that territory to actually provide that space? The second piece of this, in terms of what is the risk, is the idea that Alan Cooperman wrote about in the context of Kosovo, in the context of Libya, about a moral hazard. That when outsiders dangle the possibility of substantial intervention, and this story has been happening in Syria from the beginning, that it emboldens actors on the ground, whether it's rebels or civilian activists or others, to make choices and engage in behavior that introduces risks for them because they believe that outsiders are going to come and help them. And that kind of calculus, I think, is quite dangerous. So in the minute or two that I have left, I guess I would just ask a couple of questions. One, is doing something really better than doing nothing or doing less? Two, if one is actually seeking to defeat an idea or an ideology, can one do so through military force? If this struggle is ultimately about politics and governance, which is what we're constantly told, what is our track record of promoting good governance in the Middle East? And are we doing what we know we can do in our own countries in order to improve the odds of an ideological victory? Our response to the refugee crisis, our treatment of minority citizens in the West, our relations with states and societies in the region that actually have nurtured and cultivated Wahhabist ideologies. And finally, I'll just go back to Afghanistan in the 1 minute that I have left, to an eastern border province where I spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of years, called Nangarhar, which is on the Pakistan border. Some of you might have seen the Frontline that came out this week. If you haven't, I commend you to watch it, on ISIS emerging in Afghanistan. And there was a corresponding analysis that came out this week by Antonio Giustozzi, who's a longtime researcher in the country, who talked about the presence of ISIS emerging in this province, where I spent a lot of time. I mean, very close to where I was. It's really heartbreaking to see. And it's some combination, it seems, of disaffected Taliban, foreign jihadists, connections over the border. And Nangarhar, just as a reminder, is a province that was of vital strategic importance, not only to the Afghan government, but to the Americans over almost 15 years. We dedicated enormous attention, resources, a military presence to this single province. And yet we see that this district has been overrun, and there's a fear of what can come out of that. And so my question, I guess, is what is the lesson that we learn from that? I mean, one lesson could be that we should stay in Afghanistan, in every district, in every province, indefinitely. Another conclusion might be that even 15 years of pouring in enormous resources into a very strategically important and previously controlled provincial capital is not adequate to address this threat, which involves a set of ideas and a set of individuals operating all the way from Paris and Brussels to a single district on the Afpak border. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipali. And now Jason Healy, batting cleanup.
Hey, great. Thanks, everyone. Happy afternoon. I really wanted to bat cleanup because it was going to be post-pepperoni. And I figured anybody that stays through the end of the pizza is like actually wants to stay and listen, so I'm glad to go last. So I teach the cybersecurity topics here in cyber and dynamics of cyber conflict, so I'll have 3 topics. First is we've seen headlines about, oh my gosh, ISIS is getting ready to conduct cyber war and cyber terrorism against the West, and should we worry about that? Second, there have been some headlines on we need to up our cyber attacks on ISIS itself, and that we can hit them in their soft underbelly because this cyber stuff is so awesome, pew pew pew. And last is the implications on security and privacy for all of us. And so first on the ISIS and cyber terrorism. And so when I say cyber terrorism, everyone should go, ooh. Because that's what we've been told, right? Like cyber terrorism is going to be this really, really terrible thing. All the headlines say so. But unfortunately, the headlines have all been saying so since at least about 1994. So we're a long way into this of positing that the terrorists are going to get their hands on this stuff, on these cybers, and that's going to be the end of us. But yet still essentially nothing. And part of that had to do with the dynamics of using cyber capabilities. It turns out this stuff is really a lot harder than it looks on TV or in the movies. That it's really hard to take down it's easy to take down a target over the internet. It's really difficult to keep a target down over time in the face of determined defenses. And that's similar to almost every other kind of conflict. My background was Air Force, and there's a time in the Air Force where we thought we can just bomb runways and then they'll be down. We can bomb factories and they'll just knock over one after the other, and the society will have no choice but to surrender. But we forgot, they will fix the runways. They will fix the factories. They'll go to longer shifts at the remaining factories. And so this is a lesson that we've really had to relearn from 80 years ago. And part of this is because it's easy to take something down because it's just made of bits and bytes. It's just stuff made of silicon. And it's relatively easy to take that down. But you've all lost, or most of you here, have lost term papers that the computer eats, like the day before they're due. And it stinks. But hopefully you saved a backup. Hopefully you rewrite it. And it's not the end of the world. It sets you back some. And that's what we've seen from cyber attacks. Also, we've seen a lot of internal dynamics in the terrorist groups. A lot of these groups, especially up through Al-Qaeda, tended to be very, very conservative. They liked the methods that worked. They liked bloodshed. They liked things that actually caused terror. They were really stuck for a long time on aircraft and trying to take down aircraft. They weren't that into tactical innovation. They didn't trust outsiders. If even the US military isn't quite sure what to do with these nerds that understand this cyber stuff, an even less innovative group of the terrorists, you can see them try and struggle with this. However, we shouldn't feel all that safe about that for 2 reasons. One, we're seeing the dynamics change in that internal dimension of how the terrorists think. For example, for a long time, Al-Qaeda had to personally approve at the center the operational plans. So it was much less likely that a cyber plot was going to make it up to them. The more that Al-Qaeda became a franchise, the more ISIS says, go do local violence, the more likely that the attacks are going to happen. Now, those attacks aren't going to have a lot of organizational oomph behind them, which means they'll more be headline bad attacks rather than body bag bad attacks for the most part. But still, it's going to generate a lot of headlines and might cause, if not outright terror, then certainly a lot of real discomfort. And also because the second reason why we might see it change is the rise of gray and black markets, where now it is far easier to buy advanced capabilities off the shelf. There's a lot of people still won't sell to ISIS if they know they're selling to ISIS, because they know what will happen to them afterwards. There's still, if not honor amongst thieves, at least the realization that you don't want to be on the other end of a JDAM for selling a hacking tool. So again, it has gotten more dangerous on the cyber terror side, but still not quite as bad as a lot of the headlines that I've been seeing. So second, in cyber versus ISIS. And the main headline that's been generated here has been anonymous, this odd social collective online that has come out and decided they're going to go after terror. And now, go after ISIS. And there's been headlines of pretty senior people that have said, ooh, this is the first real cyber war that we've had. You've got Anonymous going after ISIS. And I know you don't all get cyber. It's this, technical stuff. It seems kind of magical. And so I'm going to switch to the technical term of, because I just don't buy this that Anonymous is going to be, Anonymous went after ISIS last year. Does anybody remember that? No, but it made headlines last year and nothing's happened. ISIS went after the KKK. I haven't seen that the KKK has particularly collapsed as an organization because they saw ISIS. They face a lot of the same problems that cyber terrorists have. It's easy to take something down. It's difficult to take it down over time. So if Anonymous really shows follow through, maybe they'll be able to have some effect. But I suspect, as with any vigilantism, there's going to be a lot of danger. As someone whose career has been largely cybersecurity, I'd rather not see the anonymous attacks. I'd rather vilify these kinds of tactics of wanting to take down such targets. Now, a lot of people have said, and probably even a lot of the presidential candidates, saying, well, if Anonymous can do it, then the U.S. government should be as well. And there's much to that. The United States government has had programs to go after terrorist groups online. One that's appeared in the press was called COWI, Combating Adversary Use of the Internet. Dates back to, I've seen in public sources, back to 2005 of knowing this was going to happen. But there's a few reasons that we haven't dove in as much as we might have liked, and these remind me of some of the reasons that Austin brought up. One is there's just free speech concerns. I mean, less so on a real terrorist target, but in a lot of spaces, does the U.S. government really want to be in the business of taking down websites? Second, there's effectiveness. It's a website, right? I mean, we've got these highly paid cyber warriors down at Fort Meade, and every time we take out a website, there's going to be another website that pops up. And so we end up with these, it's like using a JDAM to take out a pickup truck. This very expensive military capability used for something that's relatively easily replaceable. At last is in the business what we call intel gain loss. If you take down a website that's doing recruiting, then you don't know who's being recruited. Now, after Paris, we might say, you know what, they're recruiting. We're obviously not doing a good job of catching them because they're still able to do such things. Maybe we want to reset that, but don't expect magic. Just like with special operations, they can help on the end, but if you expect that they're gonna win the war for you, you're probably not understanding the war very well. Last, the security and privacy for all of us. So there was a relatively unseemly rush, almost as soon as the smell of cordite had left the air in Paris, of the U.S. authorities coming out and saying this was the fault of damn encryption, what they call the going dark debate. And if this wasn't for encryption, then this wouldn't have happened. And it really was right off the bat. And then they got a little bit embarrassed because they didn't really use any encryption at all. We're still learning, but from what we can see, there was very, very little. And the U.S. authorities were really in a rush to come out and pin the blame on this because they've been very frustrated for real reasons. I got into this business as a signals intelligence officer. My SIGINT cousins are seeing targets that they can't follow because they're encrypted. You talk to NYPD detectives that can't follow through and try and solve murders because their folks are using an iPhone and the cops can't unlock an iPhone. You know, I'd heard General Hayden, the former director of NSA, say, you know, we're going to be in a world, or we are in a world, where if you want what's on Tony Soprano's phone, you've got to ask Tony Soprano to unlock it. And so, real reasons to want what they want. But when I don't think it's going to matter as much as the authorities think it's going to, and it's going to cause a lot more damage than they suspect. So one, in the Paris attacks, again, it doesn't look like the attackers used encryption. That actually doesn't matter so much to me, because we all know the direction things are happening. Even if they didn't do it now, the attacks in 5 years or 10 years certainly will. Second, it will matter less for, I think, 2 reasons. The encryption matters most if you know to whom you need to listen and break their communications. And that, for example, didn't help in Paris. We didn't really even know whom to be listening to in order to figure it out. Second, the larger problem is the proliferation of communications technologies. So that if we go and put a law enforcement backdoor into, say, WhatsApp, the terrorists are generally savvy enough to say, let's not use that anymore. And we've seen them do this. Last is, even if we do this, it's going to hurt all of us that shop online, that bank online. The best security is a wall. I've watched enough Game of Thrones to know this. And the folks that do computer security and encryption keep trying to build that wall as strong as possible. There's not a lot of ways to attack a wall. Once you put in a door, all of a sudden there's a whole lot more ways that you can attack it. And then if you say, well, there's a door and then there's going to be a key, but only some people get the key, there are going to be a lot of people that know about that key and are going to go after it and steal it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Just for a few minutes, I want to see if any of the panelists have some quick questions or clarifications or rebuttals, but I want to keep them brief. We'll start with Austin if you have anything for anybody.
Well, I just want to push Jay a little bit. I actually agree with you, but just for the sake of debate, we had Admiral Rogers here recently, and he seemed to be not necessarily about terrorists, but he seemed a lot more concerned about the possibility of significant damage, and he highlighted Sony as an example that it didn't just cause annoyance, it caused millions of dollars worth of damage. So do you see a potential for terrorists using some of this commercial off-the-shelf technology to be able to do attacks at that level, where it's not the sky is falling, but it could cause millions or tens of millions of dollars worth of damage?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what happened to Sony was not terribly sophisticated, and certainly we could expect to see that. I wish I would have had time to push back with the Admiral on that, because yes, Sony being taken down, it cost them tens, if not hundreds of $millions to get themselves back to normal after that, but that's not a national security crisis in the way that we normally think about national security crises. So if that happens, if it is ISIS, yes, it is going to cause a lot of consternation. It's going to get tons of headlines. We'll be able to talk about cyber terror. But as an example about real cyber terror, I was seeing this was 2001, 2000. I was seeing reports come out from the Japanese National Police about Aum Shinrikyo was starting to bring in computer scientists and computer engineers the way they'd been bringing in chemical engineers, that they were able to track nuclear shipments due to software that was used in the vehicles or in the routing for the vehicles. I mean, if you're talking about real cyber terror, you're talking about Shoka Asahara having access to these tools. To me, that is scary. Taking down another Sony is, again, it's a private tragedy, but it's not a national security catastrophe.
Anything else? DePauli, Jason?
Yeah, I am curious, one, about the overall refugee crisis, because until you kind of brought it up at the very end, we hadn't really talked about that. Yeah. So I am curious. Certainly it fits in on the politics, but also how it fits in the saving. And then for Austin, just one question. If we get decapitation attack, I mean, if we're able to go in, we're able to drone, we're able to bomb, we're able to take out a lot of the leadership, maybe also for you, Stuart, since you mentioned a lot about the leadership, do we see that as going to change the organization in a significant way? And then also, just because I'm a military nerd, do you expect that, I mean, the French have a force just for this in the Foreign Legion. And so are we going to see the white cappies anywhere soon?
Yeah, we didn't really talk much about the refugee crisis, but it's so important. I mean, partly for the obvious humanitarian reasons, but also because it has sharpened the focus and the attention of Europe on the conflict, much like, I mean, in a more acute way, the Paris attacks did. And there are echoes, and people have been writing about this, there are echoes of the Balkans, again, in this case, in which the Europeans, for obvious reasons, begin to become very nervous about the flow of hundreds of thousands, millions of people, whatever they're imagining, into their territories. How is that going to be managed? And this idea, and we've heard this in the American, among some of the Republican candidates, this has come up, that, well, let's just create places where the Syrians can be safe inside Syria, and that way we don't have to worry about them, and we don't have to worry. And that, I mean, it's played out in sort of frighteningly simplistic terms in the conversation here. But I think in Europe, it is real. It's connected to questions around, in a positive sense, maybe, an urgency around the diplomacy that could ultimately drive the politics of the conflict towards something like a negotiated solution. But also the risk of it is, I think, feeling overly optimistic about prescriptives like safe zones, for example, when we know what's actually involved in creating safe spaces, and the commitment that's involved isn't actually really there.
Do you want to go first on decapitation?
No, why don't you go first on the more geostrategic side? I'll go into the ISIS side in a second.
Okay. So on decapitation, it's not particularly effective at doing more than degrading and disrupting, particularly with this organization. There are some organizations where senior leadership is very important, and the group starts to fall apart if they lose that leadership. And so the Pakistani Taliban, I think, are an example of that. After losing the Massoud brothers, that organization has fragmented a lot. Now, those fragments are still dangerous, but it lost coherence because it was so dependent on him. The Islamic State is not that kind of organization. So I spent a lot of time looking at its forerunner, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and if there was one thing that organization got to be very good at, and it actually came to dominate the insurgency from 2004 to 2010, it was because it was good at replacing leadership. They have a command structure, so when we killed Zarqawi in 2006, there was like a yeah moment, but it had minimal effect. We killed his successors, al-Masri and al-Baghdadi, not this one, but the previous al-Baghdadi. No big deal. They drove on, and now they're here. So if we kill senior leadership, including Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I don't see any significant effect.
So it doesn't matter that he's a caliph. I mean, I would think maybe the caliph would change that.
So this is he's different, but I mean, it wasn't like there was only ever one caliph, right? I mean, the caliphs died, and then there was another one, just like there were emperors, and emperors were replaced.
They fought over the successions, though.
I mean, I don't see that happening
No.
in this group.
I'm going to reiterate. I think that's exactly right. And I would go almost so far as to say al-Baghdadi is almost expecting it. And they're operating on two levels. They're operating on a centralized level, like a Pakistani Taliban, or really the early Al-Qaeda, the 1990s Al-Qaeda. But they seem to be preparing themselves for the next two levels, which would be franchise groups, and they're setting up franchises like the Tripoli province, the Sinai province, et cetera. And they're going for a third level, which would be, and this is why I think the holding of territory has been so damaging, because they're going for the third level, which would be the foot soldiers of the jihad. They see themselves fighting this defensive jihad, and they're trying to send, thousands or more foot soldiers back around the world. So even if Baghdadi gets knocked out, and even if some of these local affiliates get knocked out, I could see the Sinai province getting knocked out pretty quickly by Egypt and Israel in some kind of a joint operation. Tripoli might be a little bit of a trickier place. But then there are these African countries like Nigeria that are holding territory. So Baghdadi is already, and what gets me nervous is we're sort of in this pre-9/11 phase, it looks like, where bin Laden thought the United States would respond either by an overwhelming use of force that would knock them out of the Afghanistan safe haven, or would cower and withdraw from the Middle East. Either way, he wins, he saw. So I think Baghdadi is learning a little from centralized Al-Qaeda. He's planning for the post-caliphate, what they would call a guerrilla war, very Maoist, very ideological. That's what the social media is talking about. That's what some of the spiritualists are talking about, the next phase of the guerrilla war. And this is why getting footholds and foot soldiers into the West is a really dangerous thing. And if they have hundreds or thousands that are planning on doing sequences of attacks, it doesn't matter what we talk about, smart policies on occupation and governance. A few more Paris attacks or something even worse, the political will is going to insist on something very aggressive. And if we're not prepared for those answers, we're going to be behind the 8 ball. Right now, ISIS controls the strategy as far as I'm concerned. And they could take it to the next level with a couple of big attacks. Interesting public polling that I'm going to stop. Exactly 1 year, in September of 2014, 30% of Americans favored the idea of American ground troops in Iraq or Syria. It's up to 60 today. And there hasn't even been an attack in the United States yet. So you can imagine if something happens in this country, there's going to be an insistence. I mean, look at the French socialist president. I mean, he's like Charles de Gaulle now, if not Churchill. So these things happen in democracies, and ISIS knows this. They target democracies. They understand the politics of democracies better than a lot of people in this room. And they know what they're doing. So they're planning on that post-decapitation day, and they've had a year to plan for it, which has been my big critique over this past year.
And then on the Foreign Legion, certainly they could be part of, if there is a decision or the political pressure is such that there has to be an intervention, certainly. But the French have been fighting hard for a while. It's just been in Africa, right? And so I think unless they, and this is part of the problem that Stuart identifies. Okay, so we're going to pick up that set of assets and go beat on the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. What happens then? I mean, you already saw the attack, in Mali, where we lost one of our alumni here, and so that kind of, that's a little bit of a Hobson's choice, right, for the French. That might then come back. The next attack turns out it might have been from Africans rather than from the Middle East. And so what do you do at that point?
Yeah, I have a few more thoughts on that, but I want to get to the audience. We have a couple of microphones. If people have questions, I would suggest stand up, identify one of our 2 microphones, and they'll come to you, and we would like you to at least tell us who you are and where you're coming from, and if you are addressing your question to anyone in particular, let us know. Hands and standing up, please, would be the best way to go. We can go just from right to left on that side and from left to right on this side.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is John Leader. When I was younger, I went to every Columbia basketball game because they had a winning team, but I haven't been in a while. Anyhow, so I don't know if it was the intent of the 4 of you, but you gave a pretty despairing picture. My wife suggested at breakfast this morning we should move to New Zealand, and I think I'll book my ticket. I'd like to ask, I guess, Mr. Long this question. So we could have a president who is not so sensitive to civilian casualties in other countries. We could have a president who is less sensitive to American casualties in terms of the armed forces. If that were the case and we took a bombs away approach, just worrying about the short run, what damage could we inflict on ISIS over the next 12 months?
I mean, we could inflict extraordinary damage. If you want to go to, this is not what you were proposing, but let's go to the absurd level, which you would hear muttering amongst people I grew up with in Georgia, which is just like, nuke them back to the Stone Age, right? So absolutely, the United States has the ability to obliterate large parts of the Middle East. It's just not clear that there's any political will to do that. So in the short term, we could do enormous damage. We could take back Raqqa. We could take back all of these things. Though again, if you're going into Syria, you may be in a confrontation with somebody else with nuclear weapons. So we could do enormous damage. It's just not clear that that does anything for you a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. I mean, I have a little bit of PTSD about this because I was in Fallujah in 2008, and now Fallujah is once again held by people. So all the people I knew that got shot up then, it was, I don't want to say it was in vain, but it kind of feels that way a little bit. And so I worry that we will too quickly say, well, the answer is we got to take this stuff back, and 7 years later, I'll be like, well, okay, there we are again. So that's, I mean, you're right, we could do enormous damage. It's just not clear it has any strategic long-run success.
Jim Dingman, Pacifica Radio. 2 questions. First of all, what's your assessment of the former Secretary of State's speech a few days ago? Is that more of the same? Is it sort of hypersteroids more of the same? And how do you see that related to the initiatives by the administration to essentially diplomatically isolate ISIS by achieving a peace settlement in Syria, and then I gather pile on ISIS? What's your take on that?
Who are you asking? Okay.
Stuart, you want to start?
I mean, it was a speech where she was balancing, I think, the right tone in a campaign. I think she's still locking up the Democratic nomination, so she was fairly supportive of the Obama approach, generally speaking, but she understands public opinion. She understands the direction things are going, so she took a little bit, I wouldn't say she was going on steroids. I'd say she took a little bit of a more hawkish approach by sort of pushing back on the notion that ISIS has been contained and kind of going with the more Feinstein approach, because there are Democrats that Hillary is, kind of following on this, so she's not sort of out there just in the wind on her own. So I think she has sort of a group of Democrats that are a little bit more on the hawkish side, and I would imagine she's going to be hitting the tone of a Feinstein a little bit more as the weeks and months go by.
I would add in not just on the Syria piece, because I mean, and yes, that's an important point. I got back from Abu Dhabi not long ago, and I would also be interested in something in Yemen, because right now a lot of the Gulf Arab forces, a lot of their attention is still on Yemen, and even though I think they suspect that, or many of them suspect that ISIS is actually more of an existential threat, but they're not. It's tough for them to increase their attacks against ISIS while they're still so fully committed in Yemen. And also, certainly something that the Gulf Arabs would point out is if you're going to solve Syria, why not try and bring up Israel-Palestine as well? And it's really been interesting in how little, even when I read pieces that say we've just got to solve the Middle East and here's a bunch of ways to do it, and they don't mention Israel-Palestine, even though that's still an area that brings up a lot of grievances.
Hands up high if you have questions, please.
Until this morning, one particular part of the war against ISIS that was being ignored was the role of Turkey. Could we today say that is Turkey to Syria what Pakistan was to Afghanistan in the Afghan war? And if so, because there have been reports, even from Colombia itself, which spoke about how Turkey is assisting people, ISIS. So how can we make Turkey more accountable, given that it's a member of the NATO, and is funding probably an organization which is attacking the NATO? So how can Turkey be made more accountable? I mean, anyone.
I mean, I think I wouldn't go so far as to analogize Turkey to Pakistan, but I think the role of Turkey, I mean, one has to go beyond Turkey here. We have to look at the role of Saudi Arabia, of Qatar, of the UAE. All of these countries have a mix of concerns, only one of which is ISIS. And I mean, somebody, I think, I'm not remembering who it was that I read recently, said for most of the neighboring countries, ISIS is actually the third or fourth concern amongst others, right? So the Turks, I mean, we know that the Turks, they have multiple concerns, one of which is the Kurdish presence, right? Another of which is the massive refugee flow that they have coming into their country. So I think one of the challenges here, and here I think the analogy to the Afghan case is relevant, is how does one identify a set of common interests around which, and I assume that this is what Secretary Kerry is trying to do through, his diplomatic efforts, one set of common priorities that all of the neighbors and then the outside actors can agree on. And I'm not seeing how that is established at this point. I mean, as a number of people have been saying, if you really want to take down ISIS, one way to do it, and there's a limited scope to the territory that they can take back, but is to unleash, Kurdish forces. Now, they're not going to take care of the job, But that, for obvious reasons, raises concerns for the Turks. So, I mean, I think, again, and in every case, we can see reasons why the neighboring countries have a number of concerns. In some cases, they compete and conflict with each other. And I'm not sure how to, I mean, using that strange phrase of deconfliction, I'm not sure in terms of interest how one deconflicts all of that.
And I would just amplify what DePauli said, and and this gets back a little bit to Jim's question. If you want to isolate the Islamic State, people have to be on the same page. But the Erdogan government just won a very tightly contested election on the back of stirring up anti-Kurdish sentiment. Maybe they would think they have legitimate reasons. I don't think so. And so if you've staked your domestic legitimacy on being, to some extent, anti-Kurdish, how willing are you to see Kurds be part of a political solution in Syria? Probably not very, right? So it's not just, I mean, when you say concerns, I think you're right. The Islamic State is down the list for most countries in the region, not just for international security reasons, but in many cases for domestic reasons.
And I tried trying to do the mapping today, and it just felt so 1914 to me. Merkel needs Turkey for the help on the refugees. Obama needs the Kurds to fight ISIS. Turkey is fighting the Kurds for domestic reasons. Hollande needs Russia to fight ISIS, and Turkey just shot down a Russian warplane. I mean,
and the United States is isolationist.
Right. And when you try and get all of these to balance out, I mean, they just don't work, and you pull any of them, like just happened this morning.
Yeah.
And it just is going to have this cascades and this very the complexity here of how this is going to play out, and on top of EU fragile economy, sitting on top of all of that, and our election season. I mean, this is good luck in New Zealand. I say let's all just charter a plane once they decide on the flag. I don't want
some wine.
Lynn Speed with Executive Intelligence Review, and this is exactly the point that I actually wanted to bring up, because unfortunately this is not a black matter. The situation in the last 24 hours has deteriorated, taken a horrific turn for the worse with the shooting down of the Russian military aircraft over Syrian territory, not over Turkish territory. And of course, the Turks did not even report this initially to Russia, but instead went to NATO, of course,
Do you have
the
a
capital
question?
of NATO.
We need a question.
Okay.
We appreciate it, but we need a question. Thanks.
I think the elephant in the room, and Lyndon LaRouche, who founded the EIR, stated after the Libya debacle and the assassination of Gaddafi that the target was Russia and China.
All right, we're going to need a question, please, because we have
There's
other
been
questions.
a series of provocations. What we're proposing.
No.
Okay, wait a minute.
If you
What
have a
is
question,
needed,
we're
and
gonna-
I want
we're
to
gonna
ask
take it.
specifically DePauli and also
We need a
the other
question
speakers.
right now.
Okay. You're going to
Please.
get the question, but let me
We
establish
have a lot of people
it.
who have questions, so if you can ask a question, we'd appreciate it.
The question is very straightforward.
Let's do it.
There have been a series of provocations against Russia as opposed to working with Russia and others to take down ISIS. This is what was proposed, an international coalition
No,
to
we're not
take
looking.
down
You're giving us
ISIS.
proposals. We need a question if you have
I
one.
want to know
otherwise-
if the speakers, the person who has provoked this situation and blocked that is President Obama.
Okay,
And I want
thank
to
you.
know if
No,
you
no,
would
we're
support
gonna answer the
impeachment
question.
of President Obama.
That's for DePauli.
Was it Obama that?
Okay, you could. Thank you. We will. We're going to answer the question. So if you can. Right. Gotcha. DePauli.
Yeah, I think that falls outside of my expertise, so I'm happy to defer to another
Oh.
panelist on that one.
Wow, that's rough.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it. I mean, it's because a lot of my background, I was coming from a group called the Atlantic Council, a think tank, which was very focused on NATO, and so I would back the question up in saying how provoked Putin was in NATO expanding into former Warsaw Pact countries and even former Soviet Union countries, and there was certainly the sense that we might have provoked by going too far and enlarging NATO, by bringing in, for example, Estonia as part of that. EU might have done the same. I certainly get that case, that this was more important to Russia, that was feeling weak at the time. But I also don't see, as you're doing that, how when you had countries that had been invaded at least twice, sometimes 3 times, in the case of Estonians, when they say we want allies, we want friends, we want representation, we want to have safety to make sure that we don't get invaded a 4th time, I don't see how we as Americans could have turned our back on that. So I understand the word provocation in that sense, but I think if you then use that to forgive a land war in Asia, then you can also use it to forgive a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, of saying, well, they were provoked into it, and the grave breach to peace was not on the U.S. side.
And then I would just add that the Russians have violated Turkish airspace multiple times from the beginning of this campaign. As I said, I was in Moscow when this campaign began, and almost immediately a Russian aircraft violated Turkish airspace. I'm not saying that's a deliberate provocation by the Russians, but it happens, right? It's part of why I worried so much once the intervention began, because this is how these things work, right? I mean, it may look very neatly delineated on a map, but radar returns are not quite the same thing as lines on a map. And so it may have been not deliberate, it may have been deliberate, we don't know, but the central point is the Russians are not completely blameless in this.
Let's see, Anna, and then let's see.
So if we're talking about degrading ISIL, it seems to me that we should also focus on a component of ISIL's backbone, which is comprised of all of these Baathists from Saddam's regime. So, and they're the ones that have brought the military and state building capacity and expertise to ISIL. So if we start, shifting this narrative towards degrading and destroying, how do we focus on these guys? Can we do this? Is it too late already? And if not, then how do we go about it?
One quick thing on the Saddam people, and then I'm going to turn over to Austin. Yeah, the Baathists, the Saddam people are networked into the leadership of ISIS. And one of the interesting things, there's been a big underestimate of the amount of oil being sold by ISIS over the last couple of months. And because it turns out they were thinking most of the oil was going to be refined, and now they're targeting refineries and things, but it turns out most of the oil being sold is crude straight out of the ground. And it's very difficult to target that because some of these are really small wells and usually owned by private citizens and, very complex. But the question is, how is all this oil getting out and where's the black market? And these Saddam guys, you have to remember, they were part of the oil for food program back in the 1990s. They're experts at figuring out how to get unrefined raw crude out of the country, and they're doing it again. So I don't know how we're going to target them, but I think it's important to.
So I know there's a narrative that the Islamic State has gotten awesome because these Baathists joined up. It's simply not true. The Baathists have been part of the Islamic State, maybe not since day one, but certainly since 2004, 2005. They were the raw material for most of the insurgent groups, including Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the forerunner of the Islamic State. So at this point, they're almost indistinguishable, right? There were some that were part of this movement called Naqshbandi that kept themselves sort of apart, and they appear to have moved in, but it's not like they were the ones that brought this ability. What you have to remember about why the Islamic State could not take and hold territory for many years is there were tens of thousands of American troops with armor, heavy equipment, and the whole panoply there. So they were able to hold territory in Fallujah briefly, but the United States kicked them out, right? That's the central difference of why they can take and hold territory now, is they are, I know it's dangerous to use the term JV squad, but they are definitely up against, the JV squad's JV squad, right? The D team.
You're going to get in trouble for that one.
The D team.
It's a good question. In the back.
Yes, hi. Am I on? Okay. My name's Les Jameson. I'm with an organization called HR14.org. We're focused on the 28 pages from the 9/11 Joint Inquiry and bringing attention to the legislation that exists right now in Congress to reveal the contents of those pages, which, according to Bob Graham and other legislators, has a lot to do with Saudi Arabia and funding of extremist groups which is obviously very relevant to current events. So my question is, are you aware of the legislation? Are you aware of the 28 pages? Can you speak to that as a means to getting to following the money behind extremist groups? And also in relation to General Wesley Clark's revealing that he learned shortly after 9/11 of the agenda to invade 7 countries in the Middle East, one of them being Syria.
Let's go with the first one. So the 28 pages, I'm aware of it. The 9/11 Commission report and the officials are aware of it. Topali brought up some of the connections between, the Gulf states and the ideology and the fundraising. In my view, having seen a little of that stuff, it doesn't go much beyond that. I think what the 9/11 Commission report put down on paper and what they did in some of the classified briefings, and I saw some of that stuff, there's no conspiracy there. I think people are well aware of the Saudi royal family and some of the connections between the Wahhabi ideology and some of the financiers and fundraisers. I don't think anyone's shy about $7 to $8 billion being spent by the Saudi government spreading this ideology around the world. Close connection with the U.S. government since the 1940s. That's no secret either. The conspiracy, the 28 pages, not that I've seen.
Can I ask something that none of us really did bring up? I mean, are we in? Is it an interesting question? Are we in this place because of because we invaded Iraq? I mean, is that even an interesting question, or is it just obvious, or is it just, well, we did Iraq, so this is the spot that we're in? I mean, because certainly in an election season, that's going to pop up a lot, right?
No, I'm just going to say it's a great question, but here's the problem, and people forget this. 9/11 happened before the invasion of Iraq. I mean, people forget what the 1990s was the heyday of Al-Qaeda. Bill Clinton was president in the 1990s. He was the target of Al-Qaeda. So it was, U.S. policy since the Afghan war, since the Mujahideen war in the 1980s. There's a long history of Al-Qaeda growing. The Iraq war was a huge mistake in terms of it was throwing kerosene on a fire. And the Bush administration completely, for all of the talk about a war on terrorism and the war on Islamic terrorism, to misread the notion of American troops in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, in the heart of the Middle East, and not recognizing that was going to be a huge inspiration point for the jihadist movement, and it was an absolute force multiplier for them. Austin and I have disagreed before, friendly. I do believe that was actually defeated in 2007, 2008 with the surge, and I think that the defeat of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as Austin could tell, down to several dozen fighters, I think that was a huge blow to Al-Qaeda, because bin Laden put all the chips into Al-Qaeda in Iraq at a certain point. He says it's either going to be victory, or it's going to be defeat. He said, literally, it was a Manichaean battle for him, and that's why the surge was so important. So I think there was a way to pull the Iraq war out. I don't think it was perfect, but I think there was an opportunity. I think even the Obama administration and Joe Biden was calling it a success story in 2010 to 2011. So I think there was a way to do this, but none of that can sort of forgive the original sin of the 2003 invasion, but it did not start then. That was something that happened in the middle of this movement that began really in the early 1990s.
Yeah, so I would differentiate. We would not have this specific problem with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq that we have if we hadn't invaded, but we would have a jihadi problem. Now, as Stuart said, we disagree. The Iraq war was in no sense won in 2010. Even in 2010, where there were still U.S. troops there, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was able to launch significant attacks across the country, suicide bombings, truck bombings, at several points from 2011 on. So when there were no U.S. combat troops there, they could take over provincial headquarters and things like that. So I don't think we ever had
But the key point was no U.S. troops there. I mean, that was the key point.
Well, but this was my point in my talk. If you want to have U.S. troops be there forever, rock on.
No one's saying
that's
that.
The problem.
But there's a legacy of difficult conflicts. There's a legacy from the Korean War. There's a legacy from World War II, where if the United States can play a stabilizing force, the outcome might have been a little bit different.
If you're willing to stay for as long as we stayed in Europe and Korea.
I didn't know I was pouring the lighter fluid on this one.
I don't think there's too many Americans that could tell you how many American troops are in Korea, but it's in the tens of thousands. And I don't think many Americans even know that. If they're in a place that's stable, Americans don't care if troops are there.
I think there's a different point, though, about whether or not Americans are prepared to stay there. What is the perception of that presence, and how does that tie into the threat itself, right? So there's, on the one hand, the idea that the kind of, what's the causal relationship? Does an occupation and a prolonged foreign military presence prevent the emergence of these safe havens or address the problem of the safe haven? That might be true, and from that perspective, the prescription is stay for as long as possible and bring that kind of stability. The other idea is that is perceived as an occupation. There's a narrative around that emerges, and I think it's hard not to argue that the occupation of Iraq, followed, I think, probably by the Palestinian question, are two of the most significant sources of inspiration for this whole threat to begin with. And Americans also had troops in Saudi Arabia, but that also was part of an inspiration. So I mean, the idea that this is the solution, the other side of it is that this is actually, the core source of aggravation, and I think we have to think about it that way too.
Any other quick ones? We're running out of time. One, and then in the back.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I have a quick question about recruitment. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on recruitment. Could you talk a little bit about why ISIS has been so effective in its recruitment in North Africa and Europe in particular, and whether the strategies it's employing has been accounted for and is being discussed in U.S. government policies and strategies, whether that aspect of it the U.S. is aware of and is working on?
We'll do some quick answers. I just think it's a powerful ideology that hasn't been combated effectively, and the ideology is operating almost like it's a virus, and almost like a net that's sweeping through societies and capturing a very small number of people, but enough to make a difference. Because it doesn't take a lot of foot soldiers to commit attacks. We see 7, 8, 9 people could potentially become headline makers for a week, and Brussels is still on lockdown. So it doesn't take a lot of people to get sucked into this ideology, and I just think that we haven't really discussed it much today, we can maybe do another panel on it, but the ideological foundations and the way it's playing now into Western countries as well, it has not been resolved, it's not being discussed well, they're trying to deal with it in very Western models, and these Western models are not going to work. These models are going to have to come from the moderate Muslim world, maybe in partnership with the West, but it's not going to come from the West.
And this really struck me today. I saw a tweet where they had a photo of one of the attackers showing like 6 months ago he was breaking into, I think, either vending machines or pinball machines. I can't really remember which. And I was thinking, this is good counter propaganda to show what a loser this guy is. And that's how I think about it, because I work with great students, and who wouldn't do such things. And I'm thinking, well, no, that's actually probably pretty good propaganda, because it shows you can be a loser, and then 6 months later you do something important for a cause that you believe in. And so even for me, I found that my initial instincts were completely wrong in right. That supports that net sweeping through.
Absolutely, yeah,
but
for sure.
And your core question, does the U.S. government think about this? Absolutely. I think Stuart's right.
They do think about it.
I mean, the term CVE, countering violent extremism, has been a buzzword for more than a decade. Exactly.
It's everything and nothing, countering violent extremism.
It's not particularly impressive in terms of the effects achieved, but it's certainly something that everybody talks about. The problem is there isn't, Jason has referenced the JDAM several times, right? It's a relatively inexpensive precision-guided munition to destroy physical things. We don't have an equivalent for this in terms of ideology. That's the core problem.
We're running out of time real quickly, so we have a couple of bullet point questions. What do they call it? The lightning round.
Maybe we can collect.
Sure. Thanks again, guys, for the great insight today. Just really quickly, going back to, I guess, the question of U.S. forces. Andrew Basevich had an article just after the Paris attacks that recommended the U.S. and the West move away from this offensive strategy that they have and move towards a defensive one, and put more resources into kind of defending their homelands and leave the territory to to the folks that live there. Is that a good strategy or one that should be considered?
Jason already mentioned it. That's the 1914 scenario all over again, and that's the United States staying out of world affairs, and then we can see what happens, whether it's the 19 teens or the 1930s. I think that we're seeing the world react to power vacuums, and I personally think that would be a mistake. But
Well, and the point would be, so what more would we do in our homelands, right? So we would put thousands of troops on our borders, but as you saw in France, several of these people already held the passports for there. There have been U.S. folks that go. So, the worry is putting more resources into defense at some point starts to, and Jason already raised this, starts to raise civil liberties concerns. All right, well, maybe we need ubiquitous monitoring, right? That would help. But it's not ubiquitous enough. So maybe we need to be, inside everything all the time. So that's the worry about a pure defensive strategy. We live here and we want our values to be protected. And at some point, these things do start to trade off significantly.
Now, I could see helping Europe play defense. There's still a lot of productive investments there. I think much more than productive investments here.
okay, we have a 2-minute warning, so if there's any other questions, we're going to get them in succession if we have 30 seconds to do some responses. Otherwise, maybe some of us could stick around. So let's get a couple of real quick ones. Uh-oh. Yeah. Uh-oh. There were other memos. These memos were coming, fairly fast and furious toward the end of the 1990s. We're collecting questions, sorry. Yeah, good question.
Who's paying attention now?
I'm paying attention. Okay, yes, with no microphones. Let's just.
My question just concerns priorities in terms of, you mentioned the regional actors have different priorities, but for the United States, is it ISIS, is it Assad, is it political, is it refugees? What is the first step, even though ideally I'm assuming they should all be coordinated?
The election.
Great question. Real quick, if you have a microphone, yes. If not, just speak loudly.
No, I think after the deal, I want to know how, after the nuclear deal with Iran, I want to know how U.S. is going to change its perspective to its allies right now, close allies, Saudi Arabia. How is that going to change that?
Another excellent question. Any others real quick? Yeah. And then.
Stuart, thanks for the speech. Before it has been said that ISIS mainly funds itself by selling the oil that they can get from the region that they occupy. As Mrs. Republica said before, ISIS is not the main concern for many countries. And given this, is it possible that some organizations are financing ISIS on purpose to get what they care most?
We'll have to leave it at that one question. I think we're out of time.
Oh, there's
People,
one more.
One more?
Right there.
Okay, please. Just quick, last one. Stand. These are really good. I wish we had another half hour to tell you the truth. Maybe we'll do another panel.
Can I make a statement at least?
Yeah, please, real quick.
I'm a colonel, United States Army retired, and it would just seem to me we missed the boat. Isn't it all about leadership? Don't we need a Churchill? Don't we need a Truman who says, oh, look, the American people or the English people, Fairfax and
Okay,
so
no,
forth.
we got the leadership point. Unfortunately, people have classes to
okay.
get to. But
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
have to go
I didn't
Thank you, so do I.
understand what we did,
But thank you, though.
That's
Thank
what
you.
it's
All right.
all about.
Thanks, and keep in touch. You know where to find us. Unfortunately, at least half of us have classes at 2. So, thanks, everybody. It was a real pleasure.